Hi everyone. We'll be waiting 2 to 3 minutes before starting the webinar to accommodate for the rest of the attendees who are in the middle of connecting. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us and thanks for being part of our community. My name is Valan Kalika and I'll be your host for today. A few reminders before we start. If you have issues viewing the stream at any time during the presentation and are using the web browser of version of Teams, please refresh your browser. And if you're using the desktop app of Teams, please exit and rejoin. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. We will post the recordings on our community at aka.ms/security-webinars. Closed captions in several languages are available during the live broadcast, and you can enable them by clicking on the CC button located at the lower right corner of your screen. Please feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the live event Q&A window by clicking on the Ask a Question button. Be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. However, if you prefer, you can post your question anonymously, and you can do so by checking the box right below where you enter it. We often get many questions on these webinars, and we will do our best to respond to all of them in real time. In the event, if the answer was not provided, or if you may have additional questions post this event, please don't hesitate to raise them on our Azure Defender for IoT forum at aka.ms/Azure Defender for IoT_TC. If you're listening to this after the fact as a recording, that's also a great place to ask a question. Now, we'd love to hear your feedback on how we can improve these webinars, and you can do so at aka.ms/security-webinar-feedback. I would also like to invite you to join our public community by visiting aka.ms/security-community. And this is the best way to ensure you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements. On our community, you can speak directly to our engineering teams that create our security products. You'll be able to influence our product designs and get early access to changes by doing things like participating in private previews, which, by the way, you can sign up at aka.ms/security-prp. You can request features, give feedback, review our product roadmaps, register for events, or just join webinars like this. We believe that the best way to improve our products is by simply removing any barriers between you and the people that create them. So we hope you'll join us. In today's session, Phil Neri and Joy DiPietro will guide us through the behavioral analytics and zero trust for OT cyber resilience using Azure Defender for IoT. Phil is a director for IoT and industrial cybersecurity. Joe is a head of global black belts and both from the Azure Defender for IoT team. And without further ado, I will turn it over to them. Phil, Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Valone, and welcome everyone. This is obviously a hot topic, combining zero trust, which is a hot topic, with the need for stronger IoT and OT cyber resilience. And welcome. Today we have nearly 2,500 registrations for this webinar, and it's also, we've chosen a day that's particularly momentous, at least if you live in the United States. So thank you for being here. We're going to give a brief history of zero trust. I'm going to describe a couple of case studies, talk about how it applies to IoT and OT, give a brief overview of what the product is, and then lead into a demo of zero trust for IoT and OT that Joe DiPietro, my colleague, is going to do. You know, zero trust, there are a number of important principles for zero trust, and what we're going to see in these case studies is that the same TTPs show up in almost every cyber attack, applied in different ways, but the same approaches. We'll see stolen credentials, we'll see remote access, we'll see reconnaissance, and it doesn't matter if it's an insider threat or you know, a supply chain attack or stolen credentials. We're going to see the same thing show up over and over. Just a few words about myself and my colleague Joe. We've worked together in several companies now, including now at Microsoft. We both joined this past summer when CyberX was acquired by Microsoft. But you can look at our backgrounds. We've worked basically at all the levels of the security stack, including network security, application security, endpoint security, database security. And we're thrilled to be here to talk about zero trust for OT environments in particular. So if you think about, you know, what is the overall context for zero trust, and what is our mission as network defenders? Our mission as network defenders is not to prevent all intrusions, because we know that's impossible. Our mission is to reduce the probability of an intrusion having a material impact to our organization. So quickly recognizing the intrusion and mitigating it before it has a material impact on our organization. And Rick Howard, who is the CSO at the CyberWire, a podcast I listen to quite often, takes that definition and then applies it to zero trust to say, assume your network is already compromised, but now let's limit the material damage to your organization if that turns out to be true. So that is our overall goal with zero trust. So let's look at the first case today. I'm going to go way back here. This is Edward Snowden. It's an insider threat case, but as I said, you're going to see the same TTPs, whether it's an insider, whether it's an attacker that's stolen credentials, is now inside your environment, or whether it's a supply chain attack. We're using admin credentials. In the case of Edward Snowden, there's a debate about whether he actually had the SSH keys in the certificates or whether he stole them or whether he used his access to create new ones. But in either case, it enabled him to have virtually unfettered access to the internal network. And using a $100 web crawler, he was able to access over 1.7 million classified documents. In the second case, the Vault 7 breach, which happened more recently, in the report that was sent to Congress, they mentioned several weaknesses, including weak compartmentalization. In other words, once you got to one place, you can get to another place pretty easily. So that would translate into, you know, lack of network segmentation, for example, in an OT environment. Use of password sharing. We've also seen, for example, service level passwords being shared as another way to gain access that you shouldn't have. Lack of activity monitoring. This is a theme you're going to see show up quite a bit. If you're not monitoring the environment and looking for anomalies, there's no way you can tell if you've been compromised. The fourth thing here is an organizational issue. We've also seen this show up in many other cases. The Triton cyber attack, for example, on a petrochemical facility, there was lack of clarity around who was actually responsible for securing the OT environment in that petrochemical facility. Was it the IT folks? Was it the OT folks? Was it the systems integrator? Was it the vendor of the OT equipment? And here we saw the same thing in the Vault 7 breach. And this one resulted in over 34 terabytes of stolen information, specifically for CIA hacking tools. The third case study, now we're moving into an IoT use case. This is a blog post that came out of the Microsoft Security Response Center in August of 2019, where the Strontium group was observed gaining initial access through a compromised IoT device, a voice over IP phone. There were a couple of others mentioned as well, but in the case of the voice over IP phone, the default credentials had been left in the phone. The adversary was observed running TCP dump to do cyber reconnaissance and then enumerating admin groups to look around to see how they could elevate their privileges and look for sensitive intellectual property. They dumped a shell script on each of the devices they compromised so that they would get persistence. Communication with external C2 server was observed. And actually later in the report that was issued about the Drovorub campaign, that was the sort of the wood splitter campaign by the same group, the NSA observed that the same IP address of that external C2 server was also being used by this same group for a different campaign. So you can see that, you know, certain TTPs keep showing up, and if you're not using those TTPs to observe this activity, then you're going to miss an attack that may already have happened. The fourth case study, I was going to use the Triton attack, but we've used those in a lot of webinars in the past. So instead, I decided to go back and look at the very first grid attack in the Ukraine. This was in 2015. What you see there is a diagram showing the kill chain of this attack. This is from a report that SANS published shortly, about a year afterwards. And the steps, again, you're going to recognize many of these steps. Started with a phishing attack. The phishing attack had a malicious Word document that enabled the adversary to install a backdoor on a user's system on the IT network. This was not in the OT network. This was an employee on the IT network, which enabled the adversary to steal credentials to the VPN for remote access. Using weak segmentation, they were able to penetrate from the IT network to the OT network using remote access. And lack of activity monitoring meant they were able to do reconnaissance to discover networks and hosts on the OT network. They were then able to remotely access a SCADA workstation so that they could remotely control various devices in the OT network. This was a human-operated approach, which we've most recently seen in many ransomware attacks as well. And then using that SCADA hijacking, they opened the circuit breakers, so they interrupted the power. They were able to load malicious firmware into the serial to Ethernet converters so that essentially bricking those devices. So again, had there been any monitoring, they would have noticed that somebody was uploading firmware into those ICS devices. They disconnected the network with the uninterruptible power systems to make it even harder for people to recover. And then just to make matters worse, they used the kill disk malware to basically erase the hard drives of all the systems that would be used to monitor and manage this ICS network. And that resulted in several 100,000 people being left without power in the middle of winter. So again, we're going to see many of these TTPs repeated in various ways across attacks. And without behavioral analytics to detect anomalies and detect activities such as cyber reconnaissance, such as uploading of malicious code into PLC devices, there's no way of knowing if your OT infrastructure has been compromised. So let's step back for a second. This is a high-level view of various concepts that are important for zero trust. The idea of visibility, which I've talked about, analytics and automation to recognize suspicious activities, but also looking at it across many different dimensions: the identities, the devices, the data, the apps, the infrastructure, the network. In the case of OT and IoT, identities tend to be, they're very important, of course, but in the OT network itself, since we're talking about machine-to-machine communications, often it's about observing the activity at the device level and looking for anomalous activities at the device level, because machines talking to machines, and it's less about human identities. Microsoft has a portfolio of solutions, including Azure Sentinel, which is a SIEM that gives you that bird's eye view across both IT and OT, as well as XDR, Extended Detection and Response Systems, in Microsoft Defender, brought together with various machine learning and intelligent security graph tools to identify attackers that are traversing these various elements in your infrastructure. So sort of high-level recommendations for zero trust for IT and OT based on these case studies, and then we're going to go to Joe and he's going to show us how to put this into practice. Number one, of course, the key principles are verify explicitly. Don't assume that anybody has legitimate access to these resources. Implement least privileged access so that only the people who really need it get access to the most critical resources or crown jewels, and assume that you've already been compromised. So don't assume just because someone's already in your network that they have access. Apply basic hygiene, such as patching where possible. We know that in OT environments, patching is not always possible. So you have to implement compensating controls. If you can't patch, multi-factor authentication has been shown to prevent a large proportion of credential theft access, and train employees about phishing and how to detect suspicious emails. Diving in a little bit deeper, implement continuous monitoring in your OT environment so you can quickly detect either unauthorized or compromised devices, and then implement microsegmentation to limit the access if someone is a compromised part of your OT network. Microsegmentation will make sure that it can't get to all of your crown jewels, and we're going to show you how asset discovery and network mapping make it easier for you to implement the policies required for microsegmentation. Finally, unify security monitoring and governance in your SOC. You don't want a separate SOC for IoT and OT security. You've already spent years and lots of money training your SOC staff into how to handle incidents. There are some differences, obviously, with IoT and OT, but you want to integrate that monitoring in a single place. You want to leverage the MITRE ATT&CK for ICS framework, which we're going to talk about in a second, and you want to automate incident response as much as you can using SOAR tools and workbooks. Just quickly, Azure Defender for IoT. We're talking about a different type of risk when we talk about IoT. We're talking about financial risk due to plants being shut down. We're talking about theft of sensitive IP, such as proprietary formulas, and we're talking about safety risks, and the Triton attack being the best example of how an attack on OT can lead to loss of human life and damage to physical assets. And this was demonstrated in the advisory last summer, where the CISA and NSA group talked about cyber actors clearly demonstrating their willingness to attack critical infrastructure. And the recommendations that came out of that, we're going to see this as well: create a map of your infrastructure, look at your asset inventory, identify vulnerabilities in those devices, mitigate the ones you can, and then implement continuous monitoring with anomaly detection. Quickly, Azure Defender for IoT is agentless security for IoT and OT environments. It has zero impact on your production network because it uses a technique called passive monitoring. It's deployed in less than 1 day. It has 3 key functions: discovering your unmanaged devices, identifying vulnerabilities on those devices, helping you prioritize how to mitigate them, and performing threat detection in your OT network. and it's integrated with Azure Sentinel to give you that unified IT/OT governance. It's deployed by connecting a sensor, which is a virtual or physical appliance, to your network switch, which grabs a copy of the traffic using this technique called passive monitoring or network traffic analysis. The secret sauce are the algorithms that are used to analyze this network traffic, looking for anomalies, identifying assets and vulnerabilities. The results can be viewed in an on-premises or cloud-connected console and then sent to not only Azure Sentinel, but also existing SOC tools like Splunk, QRadar, and ServiceNow. And again, I want to emphasize this technology is available for fully on-premises environments if that's what you need to have for your particular needs. Some examples, but Joe's going to go through this in a second, showing the network map, showing the details on the devices, showing vulnerabilities, and showing the types of detections. And here are some other ones. And you can see here how, as part of a zero trust policy, you'd want to know whenever an unauthorized device is connected to the network. Could be a contractor laptop, for example. You might have a policy that says you can't connect employee or contractor laptops to the control network, but unless you're monitoring for that activity, you can't enforce that policy. And some other ones here that you'll see, in addition to known malware, lots of other things, unauthorized remote access, which we've seen in many of these attacks, unauthorized programming of devices, like the firmware we saw in the Ukraine attack, the use of malicious commands like PLC stop. These are living off the land type attacks where you're using a legitimate command, but in a malicious way. The integration with Azure Sentinel, and Azure Sentinel has also been enhanced with IoT and OT specific capabilities, including receiving contextual information from Azure Defender for IoT, OT specific threat intelligence from our specialized research team, Section 52, and OT specific SOAR playbooks, and the ability to look at these alerts in Azure Sentinel with a lot of contextual information, such as here we're showing all the information about some of these compromised devices, and you can see there a full demo of the Azure Sentinel and Azure Defender for IoT integration using the Triton attack as an example. And now I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Joe DiPietro, who's going to talk about zero trust architecture and show you how it applies in the case of Azure Defender for IoT. Go ahead, Joe.
Super, thanks, Phil. And let me share my desktop out. So regarding zero trust and zero trust architecture, the first thing I want to do is kind of level set a little bit. This is a good OT security reference architecture, and there's a big difference between OT and IT. And when we look at the OT environment, a lot of times people are more concerned with safety, integrity, and availability, whereas when we have the IT environment, people are concerned about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And there's a number of other differences.
Sorry to interrupt. You're not sharing anything yet.
Thanks. Hold on.
Sure.
Share. Yep. Share one more time. Okay. How about now?
Perfect. Thank you.
There we go. Great. So as I was mentioning, this is an OT security reference architecture. And in terms of the OT environment, what we typically see is safety is a primary concern, and then integrity and availability. In the IT world, what we see is confidentiality, integrity, and availability in those orders. And then the other thing, we had a question in the chat about what is some of the differences from a protocol perspective. From a protocol, there's more industry specific in protocols in the OT environment. And then you have the native IT protocols like HTTP, FTP, Telnet, SSH, and so forth within the IT environment. But as this relates to zero trust, there's a network diagram model called the Purdue model that people are usually very familiar with in the OT environment. And the Purdue model describes different levels. Level 0 is the process control. Level 1 is talking about basic control elements like PLCs and things like that. Level 2 is where you have supervisory, where you have engineering workstations and historians and things like that. And then level 3 is your site operations. And then in the Purdue model, when you start to transition to the IT environment, it's more at Purdue levels 4 and 5. And so when we talk about zero trust, you're well familiar with zero trust principles in the IT world, where you have data center segmentation, right? So you're aligning the controls with the business workloads. And then you have user access, and you dynamically grant access based on explicit validation of the current users and the device risk level. So we'll be talking about some controls in the OT world, but what we're seeing now, as Phil mentioned before, did an excellent job. We're talking about the blended cybersecurity attacks. So it's really driving convergence of IT and OT in IoT security architectures. And as we see here, many OT environments, they have a business analytic sensor so that you can monitor for predictive maintenance, but then you do the business analytics, all the algorithms and the applications inside of the IT environment. And occasionally we're starting to see, especially in manufacturing environments, where we're pushing these sensors up into the cloud. We have Azure Analytics, IoT Hub, Power BI, Azure Edge, digital twins, and all of these capabilities are used to monitor business efficiencies. How can we do more with less? And then we have governance and regulation and compliance. And then we have emerging standards like CMCC. So CMCC, if you're not familiar with it, it's the Cyber Security Maturity Model Certification. A lot of good documents here. I'd highly encourage you to take a quick peek at that when you get a chance. And then lastly, over here, between the boundary of IT and OT, you have isolation and segmentation. And so we're trying to isolate where possible as business processes allow. Sometimes you're going to have a very hard boundary in the case of like a nuclear power plant. In other cases, you may have a little bit of a softer boundary where you get different processes and people and technology. So then you have controls like identity and access control and patching and security hygiene where appropriate. So that's the boundary between IT and OT. And where Defender for IoT fits in is we cover the process control. And the way we do it is we have a network span tap that gives the sensor the capabilities having the analytics, and you're able to see the console from here. In some cases, some of our clients let the plant and engineering team see this visibility. In other cases, the sensor actually has a central manager and security console inside of the IT environment, and you may have a data diode with one-way connections to have this information. And from there, you may have your third-party SIM, QRadar and Splunk and so forth on-prem, or you may have an optional cloud connection where you have the analytics up with Azure Sentinel. So this is the reference architecture that we'll work with. And now, as it relates to zero trust, we'll break this up into 3 categories. The first category is visibility, right? Many people are just trying to discover and classify the assets with the business critical safety and operational impacts that they have. The next level is protection. In some cases, you want to isolate these assets from unneeded internet or production connectivity, right, with static and dynamic controls. So you have extra protection for certain elements. And then in other cases, you want monitoring of this. And this is where you have unified threat detection and response so that you have that convergence between OT, IT, and IoT assets. So let me give you 4 specific examples as we go through this. And the first one is with authorized or unauthorized devices. So let me shift over here and go into my screen. And the first thing that Defender for IoT does is build a topology map of the network. And as you see here, we can see the Purdue model, the enterprise and supervisory controls, as well as all of the devices that are shown here. And each one of these devices, we can highlight some information on there. But most importantly, when we analyze the network, we automatically identify all of the devices and we break them up into different protocols and groups. And as it relates to zero trust, I'm going to scroll all the way down. So if we look at this network and we look and highlight all of the different authorized devices, you see all the devices that are in blue. But if I look at unauthorized devices, I can quickly see these 4 that are in blue now. And this one on the top is of particular concern. So I can zoom in and identify what is this device. It's called the Terminal 21. And I want more information about this because this was an unauthorized device. So I can easily see what we've gathered. So I understand that this is a Windows NT device and it did FTP, the IP address in the MAC, and so forth. But you can also see this one connection stream that's associated with it. So I can highlight it, talk to this other device called EWS, which is an engineering workstation. And from here, I can look at the connection details. So right here, I see that this device, Terminal 21, was unauthorized, but it also implemented FTP. So it did some file transfer between itself and the engineering workstation. So very quickly, from a zero trust perspective, you need to be able to identify what are authorized devices in your environment and what are unauthorized devices, and to be able to get access to the granular details of what those devices are doing on the network. So that's the first component of zero trust. The next component is to be able to alert when you have a new device on the network. And when we do that, we can go look very quickly and look at the alert screen. And you have a number of different alerts, and we have port scans, unauthorized internet connectivity, excessive SMB login, some malware that we see over here. And you can see we can get into very detailed analysis on these alerts, right? And this is a suspicious SMB message, right? And this protocol behavior can be part of an attack, like from Eternal Blue or Eternal Romance, right? From WannaCry or NotPetya. And even within every alert that we have here, you're able to download a PCAP of this alert and identify what this device did on the network. But if we're interested from a zero trust perspective, let me look for new and quickly filter off all of the alerts to look at the new assets that I'm seeing on the network. And when you see some of these assets, you can quickly highlight which ones are appropriate. So I can click a button, get the alert. We can either approve that this asset is now an authorized asset and kick off part of our processes and procedures. And we can do playbooks within Sentinel to help this approval process, or maybe integrate this in with ServiceNow and open up a ticket so that you can process this. From here, you can highlight and drill down into the device itself. And this happens to be an IP camera that's on the network. So because we've already identified the behavioral analytics of this device and understand what device type it is. So the ability to identify new devices as they appear and to create a process will definitely help you in your zero trust journey. The next piece of what we can do is look at this from an investigation perspective. And you can see all of the new devices that appeared over the network, and you can scroll through all of the different details within the devices, or look over time. In this way, you have a historical perspective of what those devices are. We also can look at all of the different alerts by the different types, whether they're anomalies, operational alerts, malware, policy violations. And if we want to look at more details, we can look at what traffic by port, for example. So this will show us what are the different communications that's happening on the network from a forensics perspective. So these details are really important as we go through alerting on new devices that come onto the network. Next, let's look at cross-subnet traffic, for example. So if I go back to my network map, and this is, again, built dynamically so that when you click on any of the devices that we see here, you can see the blue lines indicates communication patterns between this device and other devices on the network. Now, what we want to do is look at cross-subnet traffic. So we can easily filter different devices. For example, here's a subnet, and if I'm interested in only those devices on that subnet, I can filter that out so I can reduce all of the noise. And now, if I look at down below, we have cross-subnet communications. So we can identify very quickly if these two devices should be communicating together. So the ability to look at the topology of the network and understand who's talking to who really helps you understand from a zero trust perspective if this is appropriate or not. So this is one aspect, again, we'd highly encourage you to take a look at is to understand the network topology and who's communicating on there. Next, and the last example that I'll give is an attack vector. So in a lot of times with zero trust, we want to understand and be able to validate these issues. So let me go up into my device map and let me scroll up here. I want to look at, for example, Ethernet IP. So I see some specific devices on my network, and I know that this particular PLC is my crown jewels. So I want to see and simulate an attack on this particular device to validate if anybody can actually get in. So I'm going to call this attack vector 2. I'm going to show it in the device map. Tell me if all the sources, based on the data that I collected, how somebody would try to compromise the environment to get access to that PLC for line 1 and add the simulation. So now what I'm doing is crunching through all of the data in the analytics and coming up with an attack path that we see. So I see one attack path that I have internet connection between my engineering workstation, and I have a known CVE that will get me access to this. And that's a score of 98% out of 100. Here's another attack path that I have an internet connection that gets into my historian that shows me a CVE that can get access to my engineering workstation, and then the other CVE that'll get access to my Rockwell PLC. So here's an attack path. And now, based on what this showed me, do I have any existing alerts that are in the middle of this attack path? So what I can do is go over to my alerts and do an advanced filter. And what I'm going to do, let me get rid of all this, advanced filter. And because I built an attack path, and you see my attack vectors, and I'll use the engineering workstation, the ROC HMI, to the engineering workstation. This shows me and confirm that. Filter off all the noise, and you can see that I had a port scan, I had some Ethernet IP, and then some suspicion of malware. So all of the alerts as it relates to that attack path are shown right here. And this will help us identify proactively and validate if my compensating controls are working between the different levels. So if I look over here from my historian and I go down this attack path, you can see the port scan, I can see internet connectivity, invalid SMP messages with some malware, some NotPetya malware, and so forth. So this gives us the full capability of understanding some zero trust scenarios. And if we summarize these zero trust scenarios, we looked at authorized devices and alert on new devices. This gives us visibility. When we look at cross subnet traffic, we're looking at protection. And if we look at the attack path, we're looking at the monitoring of the environment and validating that your zero trust scenarios are in fact working correctly. So to kind of summarize the scenarios that we did, look for authorized devices and some questions to ask. Do you know what authorized devices are on your network? Do you know who they're communicating with? And if you do, then these can be authorized devices. If you don't, what are the unauthorized devices? Can you quickly identify them, and how do you know what they're actually doing on your network? So that's scenario number one. For the unauthorized devices, it's very easy to identify within the Defender for IoT. We highlight the devices, it quickly shows us who the devices are, and then we can look at the connection details to see what's going on between the devices, from the unauthorized devices to the communications that they've made. Next, we look for zero trust for devices. In order to do this, we want to continuously monitor and identify new devices. And how do you know what their security hygiene is when you let them into the network, right? So we need a process to validate who they are and if they're authorized before you give them access, right? And so what is your procedure in authorizing this device? Is it an automated procedure, or do you just do it after the fact? And then lastly, do you have a PCAP of what they've done on the network from where this new asset appeared, especially in the OT environment? You can see over here the cross subnet communications. So if you can validate from the different network segments, and this is really good to implement before you do like a red team and a blue team exercise. Lastly here, we did validating zero trust with the attack vectors, and you can see it over here from the alert perspective. And we can also look at this if we do in the device map. we can look at the attack paths. So let me just clear this out and come over here. Here's the attack simulations, right, as it relates into the network. And all of the blue dots show you the devices that were in the middle of the attack path. So this is another way, so you can see the alerts that are associated with the devices in the attack path. Okay, so now as we start to tie this all together and we look at the IT and OT networks from the Purdue model, remember how we said that in the Purdue model, in the OT environment, here's your site operations and supervisory control, and you can see the layers that are automatically drawn in the network topology perspective, and your enterprise network layers 4 and 5 are up here in the Defender for IoT network map. Now we're going to pull this into Sentinel and look at this from the alerts that could be generated from the OT environment as well as from the IT environment. So here's a screenshot that we have from Sentinel. We've got some analytic rules that we've done. And what we have here is the ability to have custom workflow and owners. Kim Wall did an excellent job investigating this specific alert. And we can see that we had some issues with some PLC stop commands. We've got 8 alerts associated with this. More importantly, we have now the capability of integrating the MITRE attack framework, the enterprise, as well as the ICS attacks and tactics associated with them. The Defender for IoT product also sends this information, the tactics that are associated with it, up into Sentinel or to Splunk or to QRadar, so we can see the different techniques that are used in these specific alerts. And then we can also see the entities that are involved. So now when you look at the entities, we can do a full network map, and you're seeing the visualization of how this is represented inside of Azure Sentinel with the different entities, and these represent the different alerts that were associated with those entities. If we look at a timeline, what we see here is the timeline of events of what happened. And if I look at this particular entity, I look at the view related alerts, and I see over here the specific rare RDP connections for this. And this came in from the Windows Defender product, moving it into Sentinel. So you can see rare RDP connections. You can also see that this Azure directory account that does not expire a password, right? So there's also alerts that help you identify bad configurations on these specific devices. Now, if we look at how this attack traversed from the enterprise environment all the way into the OT network, let's color code this. So all of the alerts that you see here that are in red circled are from the enterprise part of the network. You see the blue alerts that are in the supervisory control, where you can see that there was a port scan detected on the engineering workstation. And we see that my engineering workstation host was compromised. And now in the process control, you see some analytics with PLC stop commands and so forth, and device suspected to be disconnected from the OT networks. So this way, you're able to get the full forensics from the IT environment all the way through the IoT and OT environment and unify this all within Sentinel. All right, so Phil, I'd like you to take it back so you can wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. It's awesome. Okay, I'm just going to wrap it up with just a few customer examples and then some links to learn more. Some examples here. The solution is mature and comprehensive and has been deployed in some of the world's largest and most complex environments across virtually all industrial and critical infrastructure verticals. The first example here is a top 3 global pharmaceutical company, now monitoring 50,000 devices in 65 sites worldwide. They have 3 SOCs, and Azure Defender for IoT is integrated with Splunk, QRadar, and ServiceNow, both the CMDB and the ticketing system. Another example for the discrete manufacturing side is a $3 billion auto parts manufacturer. They had requested a rapid rollout. They had a limited maintenance window. We were able to deploy across multiple plants in several continents in less than a week, and solution immediately detected water cry. I know that WannaCry doesn't sound like a big deal, but we're still finding WannaCry in a lot of these environments, and they're using Splunk. And then finally, one of the top 5 US energy utilities that has deployed the technology across multiple generation sites. Like many of our clients, they had zero visibility in the past into either their assets or their risk on the OT side. And a side benefit that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about is that as Joe showed, there's a lot of visibility into the network that will help resolve operational issues, not just security issues. So misconfigured equipment, malfunctioning equipment. It's often very hard for the OT team to identify the root cause of those issues because they just don't have that visibility, and this is another way for them to do that. And then Jacobs is one of our partners. They are working on security for different verticals, including water utilities, data centers, and here's a quote from them talking about how they've used the solution and highlighting one of its key differentiators, which is it's very easy and fast to deploy. In wrapping up, I'd like to point you to a number of resources. The Microsoft Zero Trust Deployment Guide is an overall view of Microsoft's approach to Zero Trust, but then the next few links are specific to Azure Defender for IoT. There's a detailed blog post, a product demo, a longer recording showing how we would investigate and mitigate the Triton attack, showing the Azure Sentinel integration, and then the product page. We might be able to give you some time back. So let me just take a quick look at the questions, and someone asked about the setup time, and in the chat, and I just want to address that for a second. Typically, the sensor is very easy to connect, connects to a span port on a switch. Some customers also use network taps. And within typically less than an hour, we're building that network map and that asset inventory that Joe showed. With respect, and then also integration with your SOC tools is out of the box, whether it's Sentinel or third-party SOC tools. It's very quickly and easy to do. Now, with respect to baselining and identifying what is normal and what's not normal, typically that takes about a week. But the key point is, unlike what you may have sort of encountered in the past with IDS or IPS solutions, you don't have to manually configure any rules. There's a high level of automation built into the solution so that all of this happens automatically without manual intervention. Question about integration with NAC tools and firewalls. Yes, there's a high level of integration with those tools because some of the folks on the chat asked, okay, so you've shown us how you can detect threats. How do you prevent threats or mitigate threats? And either through direct integrations that we have with NAC and firewall tools, or more likely you'd be using a source solution such as what's built into Azure Sentinel to automate your response. And for example, if you've identified a compromised host or a compromised device in your environment, you might issue a revision to your firewall policy or to your NAC policy to block the source of that malicious traffic. That would be an integration, for example, for prevention. Is there anything else, Joe, that you want to add before we sign off?
No, I think we've covered it, and there's a lot of great questions, that we've answered already today. But one of the biggest things is that, as you mentioned before, the ease of deployment. Because we have a patent on machine-to-machine learning, the learning period is dramatically reduced, and that really is one of the benefits for the Defender for IoT product, to be able to plug the system in, learn the environment, and get all the access to the information that I showed.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. There's a big difference between taking generic baselining algorithms that were designed for IT networks, which are primarily non-deterministic, and trying to apply them to OT networks, which are highly deterministic. In other words, the same activities occur over and over because you have machines talking to machines in a plant, for example. And so the disadvantage of using generic baselining algorithms is that the learning period is longer and you have many more false positives and false negatives. So one of the benefits of our approach is that we have the only patent for OT-aware behavioral analytics, and it uses a technique called finite state machine modeling, which you may remember from your undergrad days as a way to model the behavior of a system as being a finite number of states and transitions between those states. And that was a unique innovation that the founders of CyberX, before it was acquired by Microsoft, implemented, and we have a patent on that. And that also helps, that's a key aspect for the rapid deployment and the eliminating any need to manually configure rules. So I want to thank you very much for your time. I'll give you back the rest of your day, and thanks to Valone for hosting this session. We look forward to many more.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Just wanted to quickly remind the audience to visit us at aka.ms/security webinars for the upcoming webinars, that is. And in case we missed to answer your question, or if you have additional questions, you can visit Azure Defender for IoT forum at aka.ms/Azure Defender for IoT_TC. I would like to close this webinar by thanking Phil and Joe for an excellent presentation, as well as for alternating between answering the questions and presenting too. And I want to thank all of you for being part of our community and for joining us on these webinars. We hope to see you next time. Goodbye.
Thank you.